Thank you for joining us in the Allyship, a Lifestyle series hosted by Region 1 of the SNMA. We hope this space allows us to exchange ideas and practice essential skills in being effective allies in the fight for racial justice alongside our Black peers, faculty members, and community members.
So the title that I have for you today is Prisons Are the Pandemic. And I'll just elaborate a little bit on the context for how Kelly and I know each other. So I am one of the core organizers with the Harvard Prison Divestment Campaign. The Harvard Prison Divestment Campaign is a reparatory justice initiative that seeks to sever Harvard University's endowment from all entities that profiteer from the capture, caging, and confinement of humans. So this project, this campaign actually started as a class project in the fall of 2017 for a class I took called Race and Incarceration in the US. And the project itself looked at just simply whether or not Harvard was connected to the prison industrial complex. And if you're here today and you're like, I don't know what the prison industrial complex is, you're at the right place, because we're going to get to that a little bit later. And so Kelly, during her time at Harvard in the School of Public Health, was one of our core organizers. So that's the sort of deepest context that I've had with abolitionist work, abolitionist thought. Kelly named me as a mentor. I really appreciate that. It's definitely been reciprocal. I've learned as much from Kelly as she has from me and from all of the other organizers. So I'm here today speaking as myself, and I'm also speaking in the context of the Harvard Prison Divestment Campaign. Okay. So the agenda that I have for today is I want to spend just 5 minutes talking about what abolition is and what abolition is not. I also want to talk a little bit about what is the prison industrial complex. And lastly, I'll conclude with the pandemic of prison. And in that section, I'll talk specifically to what I think many of you all can relate to here today, which is the ways in which the prison industrial complex overlaps with different aspects of the medical industrial complex. And most importantly, how you as current and future professionals can help disentangle those. So we're going to start today with abolition. And now I'm going to ask if I can use the polling feature. Let me actually see what happens when I try it here. Polling.
Jared, I made your polling questions, so if you tell me which one you want me to post, I can launch them.
Sure.
I have them in order you sent them to us.
Sure. Okay. So before I launch these, I just wanted to get, we're going to have a series of 6 statements that you'll see on the screen, and you'll be able to indicate whether you agree with the statement, whether you disagree with the statement, or whether you're in the middle of the statement. We're just gonna roll them out, and you'll see how they connect to content a little bit later. So if you could please post the first question. The most effective way to reduce harm is to commit more harm. And one question I have, is it possible to see the results? Do we have to wait till all of the questions are submitted to see the results?
Nope, as soon as I end it, you'll see it. Should I end it?
Yes.
There you go. And I will share. How's that?
Great. Wow, look at those results. So that's the first prompt. Can you please present the second prompt?
Mm-hmm. Of course.
More acts of harm makes for a safer and more just society. More acts of harm makes for a safer and more just society. Consensus, I like it. Can you please present the third prompt? An adequate response to harm should focus on accountability, not punishment. An adequate response to harm should focus on accountability, not punishment. And if we can have the results for everyone to see. Thank you. The fourth prompt.
Fourth prompt. Done.
If and when harm happens to me, the first call I think to make is to the police. Again, if and when harm happens to me, the first call I think to make is to the police.
We're just about halfway done answering the question.
And the results.
There we go.
I feel like I'm on Family Feud. Survey says, okay, so a little bit more variation here. And the fifth prompt, people are better than the worst thing they have ever done. People are better than the worst thing they have ever done. Okay, 95% agree. Thank you so much. And then the sixth and final prompt. Structural problems require structural solutions. Structural problems require structural solutions. Okay, and the results. %92. Thank you so much. So I start a lot of facilitations with some variety of these prompts. I've changed the language depending on the audience, but congratulations, you're all abolitionists. And we did not get complete consensus on every question, but the prompts that you just responded to are the basics of abolition. They, those prompts all get at the heart of what abolition focuses on and gets at the heart of what our prison system does not focus on. These are questions that I encourage you when you leave here from today and you talk with someone about the session, when you talk with someone in your class, try not to lead with, are you an abolitionist or do you believe in abolition? Instead, bring up prompts like an adequate response to harm should focus on accountability, not punishment. We do not have an accountability system in the United States. We have a punishment system in the United States. Yeah, you may not have known that you were an abolitionist before, but now you do. And with that, whoops. So I want to set the stage for everyone here to be able to understand the contemporary struggle for abolition. So the contemporary struggle for abolition goes back at least 50 years to the early 1970s. And some of its most vocal advocates were people in prison themselves. Women incarcerated at the federal prison in Alderson, West Virginia, penned these words in 1971, just after the uprising at Attica prison in New York, which itself was sparked in part by the murder of George Jackson at San Quentin prison in California. And I'm gonna focus in particular on this section entitled How Many Lives? And again, this was authored in 1971. The women wrote, how many years of people's lives must be lost, hidden, and brutalized before we see that prisons must be abolished? How many Atticas, San Quentins, and Aldersons will it take till we realize that our society has created these monstrous institutions out of fear? Fear of human freedom, cultural differences, loss of capitalist property. The ethics of our society have been distorted by this fear and are then imposed on non-white people, poor people, young people, and women to make survival and experimentation crimes. Why should people in America spend years in jail for such immoral acts as smoking grass, getting drunk, and singing in the streets, making love, or printing obscenity? much less for standing by moral decisions, not to kill or work for an immoral government. If prisons were really to protect us from psychopaths, murderers, and thieves, they would contain Nixon, Rockefeller, Mitchell, Reagan, Agnew, owners of motor industries and oil dynasties, slum landlords, hashtag Donald Trump, church leaders, and Pentagon officials. Prisons are the extreme domestic example of the racism, sexism, militarism, and imperialism that we have been watching for years in Vietnam. So again, the word abolition may be coming into a particular public moment right now, but this movement has at least a 50-year lineage, and it starts behind prison walls with women who have been fighting against multiple systems of oppression. So fast forward 40 years after this statement, we can think of abolition in the words of the late lawyer and organizer Rose Brass, who described abolition as follows: a world where we do not use prisons, policing, and the larger system of the prison industrial complex as an answer to what are social, political, and economic problems. Abolition is not just an end goal, but a strategy today. And you may be wondering, what are the social, economic, and political problems? Well, we know from the women of the Combahee River Collective that those problems are the interlocking oppressions of racism, capitalism, patriarchy, and imperialism. And to fight against them, abolition is the means and the ends, which means that it represents the destination as well as the path to get there. Lastly, it's important to understand that abolition is itself about presence more than it is about absence, which is something we learned from the geographer and organizer Ruth Wilson Gilmore. And just as a clarification, I got this image from No Name's Twitter feed. If you don't know who No Name is, search her name, No Name, and search her Instagram account. This is not my image, but I think it's an excellent distillation of the reality that abolition is less creative destruction and more destructive creation. It's about creating spaces for people to get the things that we all need to thrive: jobs, housing, food, education, and healthcare. So to reiterate, abolitionists focus our attention on the prison industrial complex, a concept that may be new to some of you and thus could use a little bit of clarification. So the prison industrial complex is more than just the jail, the police, and the prison. Dr. Angela Y. Davis defines the prison industrial complex as a set of symbiotic relationships among correctional communities, transnational corporations, media conglomerates, guards unions, and legislative and court agendas. Also I should say, in different slides, I have a reference with a name and a year. All of this will be provided on the last slide. There'll be a link to all of the readings and resources for you to follow up on. So for visual learners like myself, this map from the Corrections Project illustrates the problem, I think, very clearly. And for those with visual impairments, I want to give a quick verbal distillation of this infographic. So I'm just gonna try to zoom in a little bit. So this map is broken down into 5 layers: primary influences, secondary influences, ideological influences, environmental influences, and problems caused by inequality. And I'll just go briefly through each one of these layers. So layer 1, which is shaded red, is primary influences, which describes the forces that directly manage the criminal punishment system. Layer 1 includes jails, prisons, cops, etc. And at this point, I really want to stop and emphasize that it's important that we understand that policing is not synonymous with police and vice versa. I use a broad definition of policing as the authority to administer so-called legitimate violence, including up to detention and death. So with this broader understanding of policing, we can understand that policing takes place all over the city, country, and world by all sorts of public and private organizations, some of which name themselves police, but many more who do not name themselves as such. So layer 2, which is shaded orange, is secondary influences, which describes the forces that bring people into contact with the criminal punishment system, such as prosecutors, tough on crime policies, courts, and rural economic developers who pitch prisons as a source of job security. Layer 3, which is shaded yellow, is ideological influences, which pertains to the institutions and the organizations that shape public opinion about the so-called crime problem. So in particular, the media, think tanks, and I always like to highlight that one noticeable absence from this layer is the college or university, which we'll address in a little bit, in which the Harvard Prison Divestment Campaign focuses a lot of its attention. Layer 4, which is shaded green, is environmental influences, which highlights the forces responsible for creating conditions of inequality, disparity, and violence. Here you have processes such as capitalism, gentrification, and corporate welfare, among others, as some of the biggest drivers of disaster. And in many ways, a situation like COVID-19 sort of links all of those into one. And lastly, layer 5, which is shaded blue, indicates problems caused by inequality. So this would include debt, houselessness, absence of healthcare, and everyday violence against women, queer, and trans folks and migrants. So the murder of Toyin Salau, our fallen sister in struggle, fits firmly within the web of the prison industrial complex. Seeing the problem of prisons in this larger vision of the prison industrial complex helps us make those connections and fight for Toyin Salau's life just the same way as we fight for the lives of Breonna Taylor, Sandra Bland, and Rekia Boyd. And there are two last points that I want to emphasize about the prison industrial complex for our conversation here tonight. First, these different relationships are enmeshed across different layers, which is to say that none of these processes happen in a linear or logical way. They're always overlapping, and which means that our resistance and our organizing must similarly be overlapping and intersectional. Second, the bottom right corner of the map, which is part of the layer that focuses on the problems caused by inequality, lists three categories of inequality in particular that relate directly to medical and health professions, which is the category of no health care, the category of medicine costs too much, and the category of no mental health treatment. So now that we've established a framework for abolition and the prison industrial complex, I want to finish by turning our attention to how the medical fields are entangled within systems of caging. Just want to stop and see there's a message. Oh, that's to everyone. I thought it was to me. Okay. So I'll finish talking about the pandemic of prison. So now that we have a better sense of the scope of the problem, it's important to illustrate how the different medical fields are implicated in the prison industrial complex. And these two domains share a rather intimate and intertwined past and present. Here's a visualization. I'm gonna try to, I don't know if all of my screen is showing, I hope it is. So here's a visualization that's coordinated by color to the map that I just previewed in the previous slide. So there are three different layers at least, and I should also say this is not exhaustive. The point of this visualization is not to say that here are the only definitive and final ways that the medical fields are connected to the prison industrial complex. In fact, if anything happens tonight, you all should be able to go out, given that you know this field better than I, and come up with an abundant and fuller list of different ways. These are just some of the more obvious things that connect to the prison industrial complex and things that I've come across in my research. So on the financial level, I don't know if people here have ever heard of the Hospital Corporation of America or HCA Healthcare, but this is a for-profit medical company that manages dozens of hospitals and medical facilities across the country. It was started in 1968. One of the co-founders of HCA, Jack Massey, was one of the principal investors in the Corrections Corporation of America, CCA, which is now euphemistically called CoreCivic, which is one of the largest private prison operators in the world. And Jack Massey, again, had direct funding ties to both of these organizations. So it's important for people to understand that the private prison industry, which is of course one small piece of the pie of the prison industrial complex, but a slice nonetheless, got its start largely from the private medical field. Also, on the financial level, it's important that we understand that medical researchers mine prisons for so-called volunteers in medical research. And there are two examples worth mentioning here. First, for the latter half of the 20th century, people imprisoned in the state penitentiaries of Mississippi, Arkansas, and Louisiana sold their blood plasma to researchers seeking to develop new drugs. And relatedly, Albert Kligman experimented on men at the Holmesburg prison in Philadelphia in order to develop drugs for different types of skin diseases, including acne. So if you've ever heard of retina A, I think that's how it's pronounced, that was created directly out of unethical experiments on people in prison. So those are some of the financial ties that the medical industrial complex has to the prison industrial complex. On the ideological level, also staying in Philadelphia, the very first penitentiary in this country, Walnut Street Prison, was created in the late 1700s. One of the principal individuals advocating for the establishment of this penitentiary was a physician by the name of Benjamin Rush. If the name Benjamin Rush sounds familiar to you, Benjamin Rush was one of the signatories on the Declaration of Independence. And he was a very prominent physician and medical professional in early America. And his idea about the prison and the jail was that similar to the ways in which diseases had to be isolated so as not to infect other parts of the body or infect other people, he proposed that prisons needed to separate particular types of so-called offenders so as not to contaminate other types of offenders. So Benjamin Rush had an outsized impact on the development of the very first penitentiary, the Walnut Street Prison, which then years later led to the Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia, adopting a completely solitary confinement model. So when people talk about the benefits of prison reform versus prison abolition, I always like to bring up that prison itself was a type of reform. And a doctor had the biggest impact on that. Another example of the ideological connections between the prison and prison industrial complex and medical industrial complex is in the work of the medical doctor and doctor of philosophy, Jonathan Metzl, who wrote a book called The Protest Psychosis that describes the ways in which schizophrenia became a so-called Black disease and was disproportionately diagnosed upon Black people who were participating in civil rights uprisings in the 1960s. And again, this will be linked at the end for you to go and do further reading. And the last level that I really want to emphasize is the institutional connections between the prison industrial complex and the medical industrial complex. So on a very basic level, one of the biggest sites of policing in contemporary America are hospitals. Many different hospitals and clinics have their own commissioned police forces. I lived for the last 2 years in the Roxbury neighborhood of Boston, Massachusetts, and you can't go around Boston and not see the abundant fleet of cars from the Boston Public Health Commission police force. If you spend time in New York City, you'll see the different police forces for hospital complexes in New York. When I did research in Cleveland, you see the Cleveland Clinic's police department, and so on and so forth. And then lastly, but not lastly, the ways in which sexual assault survivors are treated upon intake at the hospital, from everything, including invasive questioning that rely on carceral logics about promiscuity, so on and so forth. There's a really great book by Samina Mullah called who's an anthropologist, called The Violence of Care, that I referenced later for you to read more about that. And so just to conclude, because I'm at the 23-minute mark, my apologies, I wanted to finish with ways for you as current and future medical professionals to think about ways to disentangle these financial, ideological, and institutional relationships. So on a financial level, you may advocate that the organization that you're with cut its ties to the groups and people who fund prison and jail expansion. The connections between HCA and CoreCivic are likely still as tight as they were 30 years ago when HCA helped start CCA. The second important thing would be to review all research programs and to ensure that all participants in these programs are actually voluntary and are actually being compensated accordingly. On an ideological level, truly treat Black women. And what I mean by that is to understand that so much of the injustice and the inequality that was described in the map of the prison industrial complex starts at birth. It starts from the ways in which Black women are treated and specifically not treated with prenatal care, and the disproportionate number of Black women who died during childbirth. That's on the medical field to address and rectify. And then secondly, to interrogate contemporary medical racism. So again, I talked about how schizophrenia in the 1960s, as the research of Jonathan Metzl has shown, was created, was categorized as a Black disease. In our contemporary moment, there are still other types of diseases that are labeled as so-called Black diseases, and those need to be interrogated as well. And then lastly, on the institutional level, I always say this to anyone I speak to, fire all the police everywhere, and including at the hospital and medical centers. So if you have a say, if you have a union, if you have anyone's ear, bring up to them, why do we have so many police officers? What do they do? What is their jurisdiction? How can we pull the funding slowly, if not immediately, from these different sources of violence? And then lastly, center non-carceral responses and care with survivors. So again, the book by Samina Mullah, The Violence of Care, really lays out some of the concrete ways to think of non-carceral responses to engagement with survivors of sexual assault. Lastly, you can find you can find 10 books that I've listed for you to study further on your own. It's at tinyurl.com/prisons-pandemic. And I am about 6 minutes over time, and I'm sorry, but thank you for your attention, and I look forward to sticking around for the breakout sessions and the Q&A afterwards.